Hello and welcome to Pedagogy in Practice. This official Old Dominion University podcast is jointly produced by the ODU Center for Faculty Development and the University Libraries. I'm your co-host Tim Heckman, and I'm the Dean of Libraries here at ODU.
And I'm your co-host Crystal Kinlock-Taylor, Educational Program Developer with the Center for Faculty Development. The purpose of this podcast is to highlight talented educators and innovative teaching practices among ODU faculty to create an engaged community of practice. With that in mind, we'd like to start with a quick disclaimer. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the co-hosts and our guests, and not of Old Dominion University.
All right, welcome to the show. Our guest today is Dr. Kate Hawkins. Kate is a professor in the Department of Communication and Theater Arts here at ODU, where she teaches courses on health communication, communication gender, and many other topics. She's recently returned to the classroom after spending 20 years in administration, including her last 5 as the Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs and Strategic Initiatives here at ODU. On a personal note, she chaired the search committee that was responsible for bringing me to ODU as the Dean of the Libraries, so I still owe her many orders of French fries, and thanks for that. So hello, Kate, and welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And by the way, we are the ones who owe you for coming here. We're all just delighted to have you here as our very first Dean of Libraries.
All right, French fries for everybody.
There we go. Okay, I'll get us started with the first question. Who or what most shaped your approach to teaching and working with students?
Well, I've been teaching for a long time, even when I was a chair and a dean in administration. And I think looking over the course of my career in teaching, there are 2 things, I think, trends that have changed the way I teach. So one of them is that students now work so much more than they ever did when I was first teaching. I don't think I have any students who don't have at least a part-time job, and some of them have full-time jobs. The other thing, of course, is the pandemic and how that rushed us all into a lot of technology-supported teaching, particularly online teaching. So those things were major turning points, I think, in the way that I teach. And I can give you some details about kind of how those things have changed. One of the things is, and I'm not the only one who's noticed this, students don't read anymore. If they read very, very brief pieces of information. So knowing that, I still assign not quite as much reading, but I still assign reading. But what I do also is I try to find videos. If I can't find one, I'll make one myself that summarizes the key points of what's in the reading. Now, if it's a class that I'm teaching face-to-face, I can just do that in class. Of course, you can't do that online necessarily, although you can post videos. But I also summarize the important content, so that if all the time they have is to go and look at the content, they can look at the content, watch a quick video, and they'll get the gist of what we're trying to get across. Hopefully people have more time to actually go into the reading, but if they don't, they at least can keep up. So I think that's really important. And I think also that one of the things that was really stressed a lot during the pandemic is focus on the things that you really want them to take away. So that really meant going through and really looking hard at the learning objectives and basically slashing some of them, right? So that they just weren't really totally central to what we were trying to accomplish. So for example, I was just doing some reading the other day for a class I'm creating on communicating data. And there was this whole section about the history of the development of narrative. And I'm writing it all down like, oh, this is really fascinating and interesting. And then about halfway through, I thought, nobody cares about this. All right, I'm not going to include that part. But I did kind of quickly summarize the essential elements of narrative. But that's the kind of thing that in the past I would have spent more time with. And now it's like, no, we're not even going to do that. So that's kind of, the major things that made me change the way I approach teaching. There are some things that are the same, which we'll talk about, I think, a little later. But those are the things I just wanted to point out, that we're not reading anymore. And we got to focus on just the things that we need to know.
That's great. I think one of the things we've heard again and again from our guests is that this need to be constantly evolving, kind of constantly taking the temperature of how the students are working, how they're learning, and then adjusting your practice accordingly. So it's interesting to hear you say that. As a librarian, I know that nobody reads in that way anymore, but it still really hurts to hear it. So I'll be okay. I'll be over here. So moving on, what are some techniques or strategies you use to create a sense of belonging in your classroom?
Well, this is something that I still do. And some of it can be translated to online teaching, and some of it, you have to morph it a little bit. But for example, when I get to class at the beginning, the first thing I do, because it's really hard for me, is I get their names right. And I have classes with 20 ish kind of in the face-to-face. And I try within the first couple of weeks to know everybody's name. And I call them by their name. And that makes a difference to them. I'm confident it makes a difference to them. I always try to get to class at least 10 minutes early so we can kind of chit-chat around some. At the beginning of the semester, it's a little awkward because nobody knows anybody. But as we go along through the semester, there's a lot more of that. And the other thing is I intentionally try to stop class about 10 minutes before the end of class, because that gives them time to hang out and chat a little bit with one another or to ask questions of me if they have questions. Because another thing that they don't do is they don't come to office hours. So if they have a quick question, that's the perfect time to have that conversation. So I think that makes a difference. If they have to miss class, and I tell them, it's fine if you have to miss class, you're adults, I trust you. If you need to make a choice to be doing something else during that period of time, I totally understand. I just appreciate it if you'd let me know that you're not going to be able to be there, so don't worry about you, because otherwise I'll worry. And they will send me notes saying, I have to do this, I have to do that. And sometimes the thing is a thing that's of concern, right? So when I see them next in class, I'll try to get them either before class or after class for a couple of minutes and just ask them, how did that go? How are you doing? And they're usually really surprised that I remembered and that I care. But I do, and if it's something that's an ongoing thing, then I continue to sort of touch base with them to make sure everything's okay. If a student comes to class and they just don't seem like themselves, at the end of class, I'll try to sort of get them off to the corner and say, are you okay? Is something going on? And they'll tell me. And if it's something I can help with, I try to help them. If it's not, I just say, I hope that goes well for you. But that kind of thing, I think really matters to them, that they're more than, just a name on a piece of paper. So I think that matters. Another thing I do is I try to get students to spend time with each other. And I almost always have group assignments in my classes. And that has, even though some of them complain vigorously about it at the beginning, most of the time they end up really enjoying spending time with their colleagues. And I carve out time for them to do that in class so they can actually interact face to face. They usually supplement that with some kind of a group chat or something like that, which is great. But having the time to actually talk together and getting to know each other some just makes a sense of community in the class. I really appreciate that. And they tell me they do. So I assume that it works for at least some of them.
So much knowledge there, Kate. I love that you allow time to arrive early to assist students who may be there, prior to the start of a class, and then also ending class a little later or earlier rather, and being mindful of students who do have to work, who have another class, who may not have time. So that extra 10 minutes between classes could really be useful to students. So I think that's really good advice as well.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I'll mention real quickly is that when I'm talking in class, I usually try to just quickly summarize what's in Canvas and what's in the readings. And then we break up into groups and have conversations, and then we'll come back and share out. But it's always different groups. Like sometimes I have them count off, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. Sometimes I'll split them out in the room. But by the end of the semester, they will all have probably talked to one another at least 2 or 3 times. And I think that really helps a lot in terms of building that sense of community as well. So just anything that gets people talking to each other and spending time with each other and talking sometimes about things that are not just what's in the reading, I think that makes a big difference.
Sounds like it does. Do you have in addition to the practices that you're doing, do you have a particular assignment or classroom activity that you really enjoy doing with your students? And if so, can you tell us about it and how your students respond?
Yes. So, one of my favorite things to do is, and I'm so thankful that I teach what I teach because it's in the news all the time, right? So I call it, like, to myself, I think of it as the news flash, right? I don't say it to them because they don't even know what that means. But anyway, so I find something that I think, oh, this is really going to generate a lot of conversation. And I bring it to class and I share it with them. And then we talk about it. And then oftentimes they're completely shocked when they read it or hear about what it is, because a lot of them don't pay much attention to the news, right? So one of them I had was when we were talking about mediated communication, there had just been an expose of moms who are pushing their kids as kid influencers online. And one of the things that they found was that a lot of these moms are pushing their daughters, and these are young kids, right, to become kid influencers or whatever they call them. I think it's kid influencers. That the little girls will get attention from suppliers of clothing, of jewelry, of other things, and they'll get them free as long as the child will show this on their mediated channel, whatever it is, YouTube channel or whatever. But when you actually look at who's tuning in, they tend to be older men, which is really creepy, right? And they will some of the mothers will do things like, if you send money, they will send you pictures of the child in various poses that the person may request. And they'll also sometimes sell the child's clothing that they've worn and send it to these individuals. So essentially what they're doing is they're pushing their kids out for pedophiles to take advantage of, which is horrifying, right? So when I shared that with my students, they were, not surprisingly horrified by this. They just couldn't believe this kind of thing was going on. But then it led to a conversation about the dangers of getting engaged in that kind of conduct, and especially with someone who is younger. And one of the things that's a real challenge too, and they really connected with this piece, when their parents put in, or older folks in their family, whatever, they put stuff out on Facebook and other things that include images of them, and they don't really have any choice about that. And sometimes it makes them very uncomfortable. They don't want to be shown like that. And particularly when they're children, and then later on they get older and they look back on those pictures and videos and so forth, and they're really embarrassed by them and they don't want them to be out there. So the issue then is, what kind of control do we really have over the way that we are portrayed online? And the answer, sadly, is we don't have a lot of control over that, right? Because even walking down the street, you have no expectation of privacy of that. It's so somebody can video you if they want to, in whatever the way they want to, as long as they don't impede your progress on the sidewalk. There's no law against that necessarily, unless, you find the video that they have done something that violates some kind of one of our laws, and then you can pursue that if you can figure out who it was. But it's almost impossible to do that, right? So for students to come face to face with that kind of thing and really have to think about it, that generates a lot of conversation. And like one that I did just the other day, in fact, that really got people talking was, you may have seen there was a story in the New York Times about words that the federal government is using to screen grants. And so there's this list of words. And also there are words that they actually found that the Times had memos and other written documents that specifically said, don't use these words, in whatever you're doing. So I didn't say anything about it. I just printed out the list of words and I handed it out to the students, and I had them in groups. I said, look at the list of words and tell me what do you think about them? And the more they read the list, the angrier they got, because the words were all about anything that had to do with people of color, anything that had to do with intersectionality, anything that had to do with transgender individuals. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on and on. And this is a class in communication, sex, and gender, so it's perfectly appropriate for us to have that conversation. But one of the things that they found, I didn't plant this, they found it, was that it is okay to say man, but the list includes the word woman. And to have conversation about that and how that then applies to, some time ago, we had talked about linguistic relativity, that the way that the language we use shapes our perception. And then also when people hear the language we use, it shapes their perception. So if suddenly words disappear from the vocabulary, it in effect has the consequence of making certain things invisible. So if we're not allowed to talk about LGBTQ individuals, we're just not allowed to say those words, how does that make them feel, right? But it also has the consequence of making them invisible to other people. And that was a source of great consternation, in the class and talking about that. Some of them didn't know some of the words, so it gave us an opportunity to kind of talk about that. But most of the words they knew. There was nothing, there were very few things that people really had no idea what that word meant. There were a lot of words that they were used to seeing all the time. And the thought that they would be told that they were not supposed to use those or discouraged from using those. If they have a grant application, if they're involved in something like that, particularly graduate students, and the grant doesn't go anywhere because it has the wrong kind of word in it, that's going to influence them and affect them too. So that whole conversation really brought home the kinds of things we talk about in class. This matters to you today. So yeah, that kind of thing, making the applicability really clear to them in today's world. It's not just something, a scholarly piece of, a journal article or something that was published 10, 15, 20 years ago. This is today. And here's how this is a reflection of what we're talking about in class, and also how it affects you personally and people So I think those are things that I just really enjoy doing. I did something the other day that was just a total hoot, that was really fun. And I'm teaching a class, or I will be teaching a class in communicating data. And one of the things that we know about most people is that people don't really spend a lot of time outside of math class thinking about math, unless it's part of their job, right? If it's part of their job, that's different. But folks who don't do that for a living, they don't spend a lot of time focused on things about math. So what ends up happening sometimes is that people gloss over details that include numbers when they're reading things in news stories or hearing someone talk about it, they're looking at something on social media. So they see these numbers, but they're not 100% sure what it means. Sometimes they draw the wrong conclusions. Sometimes they're put in front, those kinds of pieces of information are put in front of people in such a way that it leads them to draw the wrong conclusion. So there's misinformation and disinformation, right? So with about 50% of adults in the United States have pretty basic literacy skills, and about half of that number have only very basic numeracy skills. Anytime you're talking about math and statistics and so forth, there's a lot of opportunity for people to make mistakes. We draw a conclusion from it quickly. We don't really think about it. And sometimes we make mistakes with that. So what I did is I went over to Web Center with $400 in cash, $20 bills, and I had a video crew with me, and I put up a sign that said, $20, answer an easy math question, right or wrong. So within a very short period of time, I had my 20 students had lined up, right? So this was going to happen quickly, as I knew that as soon as people knew they were going to get $20 for answering an easy question, had a big crowd. So I asked them questions, really quite simple questions about math, but these are the kinds of things about which people will frequently make mistakes. So we recorded them, and whatever answer they gave, I say, great answer, and I give them the $20. But most of the students got them wrong. And, these are people who are, they're educated individuals. They know that they have to think through the answer to this. It's not just something that's going to fly by them really quickly, and yet they still got it wrong. And I think it's because we just don't spend a lot of time drawing people's attention to things like that and really talking about it. For example, whenever we're talking about, you see on television, there's this person running for this office, and here are the two candidates who are running, and this person's polling at 53% in the poll, this person's polling at 47% in the poll. That means the person with 53% is way ahead, right? Well, they don't really stress, it's in little tiny print usually somewhere on the screen, that there's a plus or minus 3-point range of error with that, which means that that's 6 points between those two, right? So 53 to 47, that's 6 points on that scale. What that really means is that they're tied. They're still tied. But people will see, oh, that other person's way ahead. They're not. It's just sampling error. But that's the kind of thing I was talking about, that many people just don't pay enough attention to that, and they're drawing the wrong conclusions from things that they see. Right? And so those little video clips are going to be at the beginning of the course to make the case that even educated college educated people make these mistakes all the time. And what consequence does that have, not just for the person who's being exposed to that information and learning from that information, but what does it tell us about people who are supposed to be communicating data to others in an accurate way? How can we do a better job with that?
That's great. I think that's a really awesome assignment. That sounds like a really good course, actually. I think communicating data is really hard. I was just looked up Daryl Huff's How to Lie with Statistics is 70 years old now and is probably still as relevant as ever. Amazing book, very short, like and it tells you everything you need to know about some of the intentional and unintentional ways that people use data.
Yeah. I have that signed for the class, by the way.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I knew you would. Maybe we've talked about it before. I don't know. So let's move on a little bit. And we've talked a little bit about changing up your strategies and stuff, but let's talk a little bit about how you adapt specifically when you transition between in-person and online formats. And are there any key differences in your approach?
Yes. I think there are a lot of things you do differently because you don't see them, right? Except if you do asynchronous, and that it makes online instruction, at least for the students that I work with, it makes it less convenient for them. And I have students who are working 2 night jobs. They don't have time to do anything but just a little piece of time, right? And so a synchronous class makes it much harder for them. So most of my time I'm online with people, it's asynchronous. So you have to keep that in mind. But what it comes down to is way more intentionality, at least for me, in creating the class on the front end, and way more detailed feedback during the course of the class. So I always give a personal reflection. That's an assignment that I do in all of my classes, where they have to reflect on what was covered in that module and give a personal example of how they would incorporate that into their own behavior and become better communicators as a consequence. So what I would do then is, they're like 200, 250 words. That's the minimum. Or a discussion post, same thing. It's about that many words, maybe a little less. So then I give feedback on it. And I don't just say, good job, not a good job. I actually go into giving them detailed feedback. And I've caught myself sometimes making my feedback longer than what they submitted in the first place, because I'm sharing examples of what they're talking about and how that works in the context we're operating in and what we're talking about. So lots and lots and lots of very specific, detailed feedback. Here's what you need to do next in very specific, detailed ways. And on the front end, explaining things and giving multiple examples of things, and having short videos where they can go to the video and get the main points and so forth. I do a lot of that because I'm not going to have the chance to talk with them much. I have a lot of online office hours. I offer to meet with them whenever it's convenient for them. And I'm telling you, I get 2 or 3 people in the course of a semester who actually want to talk about something. They really rely on what you put in Canvas. And if it's not there, you may not hear anything from them until they submit something that's wrong. Like, for example, one of the things I discovered is that students were not using the right material on their personal reflections. They just got confused about what to put. It was in the syllabus, but what I ended up doing was putting it in Canvas, very big, bold way that they couldn't miss it. So if they even go to look at when it's due, they're going to see what the topic is. It's right at the top. So you can see, oh, I'm supposed to be writing this on verbal communication. Okay. And sometimes they just miss that entirely. So things like that. I just try to make it as structured and clear as I possibly can.
Thank you, Kate. So intentionality with initially creating the class, and then that detailed feedback that you mentioned for those online classes as well. And then our last formal question, how do you stay up to date on the latest teaching strategies and tools? And can you recommend any resources that have helped along your teaching journey?
Well, of course, I would say that ODU Center for Faculty Development is a very rich source of all kinds of information. I encourage people to go to the website and go and see all the things that are there. It's just amazing. So I really thank you for that. And I know, Crystal, you are personally responsible for a lot of that. So thank you very much for that. Also, there's a woman who publishes in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Her name is Beth McMurtry. You may have heard of her. She does a teaching newsletter. And I had just found that really interesting. I just will quickly go through it sometimes and see if there's something that I can pluck out of it that I can use in my own class. And I can't think of an example this minute. I should have written one down ahead of time. But I have seen things in there that I thought, that makes a lot of sense. Let me try that. In fact, she was the one who was really stressing during the pandemic the importance of stripping the course down to only the essentials that you want them to know. And as I mentioned way back at the beginning of our conversation, that was just a real game changer for the way I thought about teaching. For that, I would encourage people to look at that as well.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. Big plug for the Center for Faculty Development. Good folks over there. I know a couple of them. They're all right. They're doing the
Good.
Lord's work. We had another guest on, Jay O'Toole, who does a lot of workshops with the center, and he also talked up some of the really phenomenal work that they're doing. So, all right. So this has been great. To wrap up our conversation, we have a couple of just kind of fun, quick questions, just so folks get to know you a little bit better. We know a little bit more now about your approach in the classroom, but we're get to Kate Hawkins, the person. So the first one, if you're ready, is what was the last book you read or listened to? Because we don't discriminate. And would you recommend it?
Oh, well, I'm glad you asked me that, because I have this book called Heart Over Hype it's called Transforming Higher Ed Marketing with Empathy. And it was written by one of my dear friends. Her name is Jamie Hunt, who actually was here at ODU, but I knew her way back when she and I were both at Radford University. And then she went on and became vice president of university communications, like 3 other places. And then we both ended up back together again here, which happens in academia sometimes, right? And I heartily recommend that, because she's taking a very different approach to higher ed marketing, and I love it. So, and it's something that I haven't finished it yet, but I'm confident there are things in there that I'm going to be able to incorporate in the classroom.
Yeah, that's great. Jamie's great. She's very, very talented. I didn't realize that was out already, so I'll have to go take a look. I know the answer to this one. How do you unwind after a long day?
Oh, I take my dog for a walk. My dog, Jack, my baby. He's my lab hound cross. He's a rescue. He's probably around 9 years old. And that dog loves nothing better than going for a WALK. He just loves those. So I just love to do that. The other thing I do is I have a horse. She's out in Virginia Beach. She's getting older now, and I'm getting older, so we don't ride as much as we used to, but I still love to go out there and just give her carrots and groom her and just be out in the nature. It's just so different when you're out there. All you can see is nature, and all you can hear are the birds and the horses chewing their hay. I mean, it's just such a zen kind of a place to be. So those things.
That sounds really nice. And I like that you spelled out WALK, just in case Jack was listening. We don't want him to freak out unnecessarily.
Yeah, he'd be very happy. Are we going on one of those? Okay.
Oh, yeah. I heard it on the podcast.
Yeah.
And then our last question for you is, what do you like best about your role and your work as an educator?
Oh, my gosh. I love being around students. I just do. I always have. I mean, I first stepped into a classroom, I thought, this is what I want to do. And I will tell you, when I first started, I wasn't very good at it. And that was back in the day when they threw you in a classroom without any kind of instruction at all. It's like, go, here's your book, go. And so, as you might imagine, the results were sometimes good, sometimes not. But over the years, I've really gotten to where I have a pretty good sense of how to connect with students and how to help them to develop their skill set in a way that's meaningful to them. And that is so incredibly rewarding to me. And another fun, I don't know if it's fun, but it's a fact. I have spent a bit of my life working with abused animals, abused dogs and abused horses. And so I have developed kind of, I think, a way to connect with animals that don't trust. And it absolutely does translate into the classroom when you have a student who doesn't think that anybody cares and has, maybe has had a bad experience with a faculty member, or maybe a lot of bad experiences with a faculty member. So some of the same things really work. And being able to see a student who didn't really want to be in the class begin to really enjoy it and thrive in it, and realize that they've got a lot to offer in a way they might not have thought of themselves offering before, that is probably the most rewarding thing I've ever experienced in my life. So what you said earlier about going out there doing God's work, that's what that is.
Well, Kate, we appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining the podcast, and we enjoyed learning about you and your various teaching practices. And thank you, listeners, for joining us today. Pedagogy and Practice is an official podcast of Old Dominion University, the Center for Faculty Development, and ODU Libraries. Your co-hosts are Crystal Kinlock Taylor and Tim Hackman. Original music composed and copyrighted by Richard Sigwald. Find and follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you download your favorite podcasts. Visit ODU Center for Faculty Development homepage for more information about the show and for more information about ODU. Thanks for listening.